Welcome to the webinar on developing individual authorities test guidelines in the absence of a UPOV test guideline. This is the second webinar of the series taking place this week. The program for today will start with a short introduction on existing UPOV guidance on how to proceed in case there's no UPOV test guideline and you would like to develop an individual authorities test guideline, which will be followed by the experiences of UPOV members, which will be presented in a first webinar during the morning, a second webinar in the afternoon. Just to set the scene, a bit of UPOV guidance, and in particular, the general introduction to the US. You will all hear about the general introduction. It is also referred to as TG1, which is currently in its third revision, therefore TG1-3. The general introduction has a series of associated test guidelines procedures, therefore TGP documents, which is also another acronym commonly used in the UPOV community. In these documents together, they set out the principles which are used for the examination of distinctness, uniformity, and stability. All this documentation is available from the UPOV website. For a newcomer to the UPOV community, the general introduction to the US is the single document where you will have an overview of the entire DUS procedure from before the growing trial, even starting with the constitution, maintenance of variety collections, those varieties of common knowledge that should be considered for the examination, continuing on to the growing trial itself, and also supplementary procedures as how to deal with the information that is generated and how to make it available to the wider UPOV community. The associated documents to the general introduction encompass a set of some 15 TGP documents, which would go further into the details of, for example, examination of distinctness, uniformity, stability, but also on how to develop test guidelines. More specific to the individual crops and species or variety groupings, there are test guidelines. So these test guidelines build upon the information provided in the general introduction, plus the associated TGP documents, to provide more detailed and practical guidance for examination of the US of these individual species or variety groupings, but moreover identifying the characteristics that are used by UPOV members and that are brought together for all the UPOV community to produce harmonized variety descriptions in the examination of the US. The objective of the test guidelines is to provide international harmonization according to existing practices from members. It would therefore not be appropriate for UPOV to initiate the development of a test guideline where there is no national experience or regional experience within a UPOV member. So we will always build upon existing experience test guidelines that the individual authorities have tested and would bring for international harmonization in the UPOV community. There are currently 337 test guidelines, all freely available on the UPOV website, where you will find the list of characteristics that are proposed to be used for the individual species. These test guidelines, they explain what needs to be observed in terms of characteristics, or more specifically the organ to be observed and the specialty within that part of the plant to be observed. Also providing information on what type of characteristic is it. Is it a quantitative characteristic, qualitative characteristic, or a mixture of both as pseudo-qualitative characteristics? It provides the naming for the states of expression within that characteristic, as well as it illustrates the range of variation for that characteristic with the proposed notes for that characteristic. It also explains when should a characteristic be observed through providing the growth stages in which DOS examination would require the experts to assess characteristics. It also provides explanation on how to observe these characteristics, as whether they should be visually observed or they should be measured, and whether individual plants or groups of plants would be used, plus an explanation for the individual features on how to observe the characteristics. Currently, the existing 337 UPOV Test Guidelines, they are used for the vast majority of applications received. And as you can see in this graphic, 94% of all applications for plant variety protection are covered by an existing UPOV Test Guidelines. Having said so, UPOV members receive applications for plant variety protection for more than 4,000 different genera and species. And we only have 337 test guidelines. So here comes the question to be addressed over the course of the webinar today: how to deal with these more than 4,000 genera and species that may not necessarily be covered by an existing UPOV test guidelines. And in particular, how to proceed according to UPOV principles to assess DUS for these genera and species. The answer starts from the general introduction to DUS. In document TG1, we have a proposal that DUS testing should be based on the experience of other members of the union. In this sense, if you come across a crop for which there's no UPOV test guideline, you will be invited to first tap into existing resources, tap into existing experience of other UPOV members. You may do so through different procedures. The first, you may look up in the Genie database, the database for genera and species, where you can type a crop by the botanical name, by the common name in different languages, and you will find a list of authorities that declare possessing experience or practical experience in the examination of that crop. There are a range of possibilities to find these authorities with practical experience, and you have a dedicated web page for practical experience in DUS examination on the UPOV website, where you will also be able to find a list of contact persons. So at the very bottom of this tab, you have the list of contact persons within UPOV members, which you can contact for cooperation in the DUS examination, so that you can first identify the authority that has experience with a particular crop, and then contact the individuals who would be in charge of providing cooperation for the DUS examination. All this information is available from the website, and you have the web links displayed on the screen and throughout this presentation. Another possibility of identifying experience amongst UPOV members is to use the plant variety database, commonly known as the Pluto database, where you can find for authorities that are receiving applications for the same crop, for other related crops within the same genus, or for even other crops, other related crops from other genus, other genera within the same family. In the case that you come across a first application for a crop for which there's no experience in other UPOV members, the general introduction proposes that you initiate, that you develop a test guidelines, a national test guidelines, following the principles set out in the general introduction, plus all the associated documents, and in particular, document TGP7, titled Development of Test Guidelines. Having said that, I would like to continue on to the next section of our webinar, and during this first run of the webinar, we will have the contributions of the colleagues from Germany and Japan. And I would like to start by inviting the colleagues from Germany to share a bit of their experiences. And in this regard, I would like to invite Ms. Beate Rücke for the first presentation. Please, Beate, you have the floor, and just let me know when I should advance the slides. I'll be sharing the screen here on my side. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Good morning to everybody. At least in Germany, it's morning. I tell it from my perspective. Thank you, Leontino, also for the very clear introduction, which I expected, and therefore I have not taken up all these elements in my presentation again. I would just like to give you an idea about the situation in Germany in relation to guidelines or species where no UPOV test guideline exists. Please give the first. Yes. What is the relevance of national guidelines in the absence of UPOV test guidelines? We have, within the last 10 years, tested about 286 species. And 191 species of these were covered by UPOV test guidelines. That means we were doing the test according or in accordance with the UPOV test guideline. On the other side, there are 95 species which have been tested without UPOV test guidelines on the basis of national guidelines. It shows that it is a quite routine procedure that there are national guidelines. National guidelines are always developed when applications are filed in a new crop, more or less on the few years basis, sometimes every year, sometimes every few years. In general, if we talk about national guidelines and new national guidelines, we are talking about new crops which are normally minor crops. They have a very few applications. There are not so many varieties of common knowledge to be considered. And thus, therefore, of course, we can follow more or less all the recommendations as well for new species and types of varieties. The basic point is, if you want to develop a national guideline, you need practical experience before any TG can be established. It means new guidelines are developed on the basis of the first DOS growing trials. The first trial will probably be the first testing year of your new application, but it will not be the last year to establish a guideline. It will be necessary to revise this guideline with more experience. If you have more experience, that means the development of a guideline is always a process, and it's not finished cannot never be finished after 1 or 2 years. How we develop a guideline, as mentioned before, I can only underline that we are considering all the guidance provided in TG 1.3, in TGP 7, of course, in TGP 13, guidance for new types and species, and we look, of course, for other UPOV and national TGs for similar crops. Leontino just mentioned to contact the element or the step in the process to search for experience in other UPOV members. Here I would like to mention that for us, the main source to look for experience is Pluto. To look in the variety database, to check where all over the world are varieties already protected, and then to contact, if appropriate, these authorities, depending on the region and so on. This is the best, yes, basis to get experience or to get knowledge about experience in other member states. What are the main elements for the TG development? First, we need to be able to establish appropriate trials. Sometimes these are also new crops from the growing perspective for us. We need knowledge in relation to plant cultivation and growing conditions to be able to grow the plants in a proper way. The next element is that we have to analyze the phenotypic variation in the crop. Therefore, we need an inclusion of appropriate material in the growing trial. We need to identify characteristics which are useful to describe variation between varieties. For that purpose, it's important to have as much variation in the trial as necessary to look on available varieties. Maybe that there are no varieties because it's a new crop, but to look also on other material from the market, from gene banks, etc., from botanical gardens maybe. It's not important to have varieties. It can be any material where we have variation. Even a mixture is very useful. Sometimes I say, oh, it's a nice mixture to develop a guideline because you see in one sample all the variation of the crop. And it's important to identify characteristics. Then if we see that there is variation, we have the evaluation whether these potential characteristics fulfill the requirements for DOS. For that, I will not name it everything now, but it's clearly described in TGP 1.3 in section 4. The main element is the range of variation in the species and, of course, the environmental dependence of the characteristics, whether they are useful for DOS. And the last step, of course, is the definition of appropriate characteristics and the scales. And for that, the relevant guidance is provided in TGP 7. And of course, we would always look in other TGs for similar crops. There is already a lot of guidance there. And what is, of course, also necessary is then the next step to evaluate the uniformity issues, definition of uniformity requirements. And for that, I can refer again to the TGP documents, to TG 1.3, it's not TGP, it's TG 1.3, TGP 10, and TGP 13. And I think that's all what I wanted to say. Thank you for your attention. And of course, I'm ready and available for any questions now or later in the questions session. Thank you.
Thank you, Beate. We will take the questions in a moment. Once we complete the sequence of presentations, we will have a dedicated space for the Q&A session. So please prepare and type your questions on the chat or get them ready as we will take them up in a moment. We will continue our webinar with the following presentation from Japan, and we would like to invite Ono-san to please guide us through your experience in dealing with the development of national test guidelines in the absence of UPOV test guidelines. Ono-san, you have the floor, please.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, we can, loud and clear.
Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Yoshiyuki Ono from Japanese Plant Variety Protection Office. So today, I will inform you that our experience of the US examination without the use of UPOV test guidelines. Next, please. You can see the number of the Japanese national TGs and the number of the UPOV TGs. Japan has 725 TGs in total, which contain the 200 50 TGs are same crop with UPOV. The breakdown of the 250 common crops could be separated by 198 TGs harmonized with UPOV TG. So you can see the bottom boxes, which is only Japanese, only Japan TGs, 475 TGs, and also only UPOV TGs, 88 TGs. Next, please. Background. We have 3 patterns to develop our national TGs when we received the PBR application of new species. Pattern 1, developing the national TG based on the UPOV TG or overseas TG for new species. Pattern 2, developing national TGs based on the existing national TGs in Japan of similar or closed species. Pattern 3, developing new national TGs from scratch. Pattern 1 and Pattern 2 has no difficulty and no need to so many burden. However, Pattern 3 requires taking long time and need to much effort. Next, please. So here we have the solutions. Development of national TGs for new species need to a lot of burden and effort, though they are seldom used. PBR applications of such new species are rarely filed. Almost all varieties of such species seems to they will never be filed for the PBR application. The idea was considered that solutions for the reducing workload to develop national TGs for each new species. Development of generic TG were approved by Agricultural Material Council in Japan. This idea was good solutions for which means no need to any amendment of the Plant Variety Protection Act and no need to any amendment related to regulations. This idea was within legally. Next, please. Flow chart. When we have PBR application of new species, check the presence of the UPOV TG and overseas TG. If we have yes, pattern 1 will be applied, developing the national TGs based on the UPOV TG or overseas TG. If there are no UPOV TGs and no overseas TGs, next checking will have similar species TG or closed species TG to cover or divert to new species, which is applied pattern 2. If there are no similar species or no closed species, developing new national test guideline for the new species from scratch as pattern 3. We will check the number of the varieties in the market and breeding activities for way up 2 options, pattern 3 and new pattern. So new option, generic TG is quite efficiency. However, we have to check whether possibility of occurring disputes of plant breeders' rights by using generic TG or not. Next, please. Establishment of the new categories in Ordinance of Enforcement of PVP Act to use generic TG for the new species of ornamentals. Among the new species for the which PBR application are filed, such new species that have a small distribution in the market in Japan and have difficult to define the important characteristics are examined according to the following categories. So here we have 4 generic TGs which categorized other ornamental trees, other bulbs, other orchids, and other ornamentals. So DUS examination will be based on the common important characteristic set in each category. The state of expression will be based on absolute value, including numerical value of statistical analysis without note 1 to 9. After the DUS examination, if another application for the same new species will be filed, the specific national TG will be developed. Next, please. So here we have the variety description example, generic TGs for the other ornamental trees. I would like to explain for the generic TG again. DUS examination will be based on common important characteristics set in each generic TGs. The state of the expression will be based on absolute value, including numerical value of statistical analysis without note 1 to 9. You can see description here. It didn't use the note. So you can also see the plant height, which was 83 centimeter in average, with plus minus 12.34 as a standard deviation. Of course, t-test, f-test, or LSD are possible to allow for distinctness. However, normally no need to the statistical analysis for the ornamental plants. Description is possible to describe flexible description at case-by-case basis. After the DUS examination, if another application for the same new species is filed, the specific national TG will be developed. Next, please. So here we have the relevant Japanese law and regulations. I would say, what is the important characteristics? Important characteristics is just the terminology of the Plant Variety Protection Act. I think UPOV Convention 1978 Act also uses terminology of important characteristics. These 3 legal documents define the important characteristics, plant species, and test guidelines as legal basis. So my conclusion is this idea of flexible description by generic TG was no needed to any amendment of such legal documents. Next one, next please. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. My name is Maria Lilia Lozada. I work at the Plant Variety Protection Office in Argentina. And today I will tell you our experience in the topic developing test guidelines in the absence of UPOV test guidelines. So the National Seed Institute in Argentina, it's a government agency where works the PVP office. We have 2 types of registers, the national list and the plant breeders' rights. Both of them are under sworn declaration. So that means that the applicant declares that the information that they provide is true and accurate to the best of their knowledge. Next, please. So the first question is what we do when we don't have UPOV test guidelines. And first, we search in UPOV Pluto database if the variety or some variety of the same species is already registered in another country. And if it yes, we ask to the authority, and first we go to the website to see if the forms, the description form, or maybe the test guideline is available to be downloaded. And if not, we put in contact by email, going first to the list of members in the website of UPOV, and we put in touch by email. If they don't have that experience, or maybe they don't have that documents, we ask to the applicant if they have that information or maybe a good description of the variety. Next, please. Next. And what happens when there are no UPOV test guidelines and there is no authority working on that? We usually work in collaboration with the applicant in this case, because if the applicant has enough botanical experience, maybe the breeder can provide that information, and INASE makes the technical adjustment linked to UPOV recommendations, like using the general introduction to the US exam, maybe checking characteristics if are good for distinctness, the states of the characteristic, the range, and if illustrations are okay. But if the applicant or the breeder hasn't that information, we ask for an exact description of the variety to the applicant. But here we take care that the applicant doesn't describe the species instead of the variety. And for this, we use bibliography, maybe books, botanical books, or UPOV documents, or UPOV test guideline for another species or similar species. And finally, here you have our website, and here you can find our description forms. Some of them comes from the work in collaboration with the applicant, and others come from the TG UPOV test guidelines. And that's it. Thank you very much for your attention, and here you have my contact.
Thank you, Lilia.
You're
We
welcome.
will keep the questions to the Q&A session in the end.
Perfect.
So at this point, I would thank Lilia for the presentation, and I would invite our colleagues from South Africa to proceed to take the floor. Hello, Adrian. Welcome. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Leontino. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Adrian de Villiers, and I'm a DUS examiner from South Africa. This short presentation will focus mainly on the procedures we follow in South Africa when examining or developing a DUS test guideline in the absence of a UPOV test guideline. Now, the subject of a test guideline usually depends on the information provided by the applicant in the technical questionnaire. But as this is a first-time application, there will be no technical questionnaire for this application or for this crop. In this case, we usually provide the applicant with a technical questionnaire of a similar crop. And if there is no similar crop, we do have a generalized technical questionnaire which the applicant may complete. Both the material required and the method of examination depend mainly on the method of propagation of the crop. For example, for a seed-propagated crop, we will ask the applicant for a certain number of seed, and for vegetatively propagated crops, we will ask the applicant for a certain number of bulbs or tubers or cuttings or mature plants. For the assessment of distinctness, uniformity, and stability, we follow the UPOV recommendations as set out in the general introduction and the associated TGP documents. Next slide, please. Before developing our test guideline, we always start with basic research on the genus, the species, and also on the specific variety that the application was made for. This information we find in botanical literature, also in the information provided by the applicant in the technical questionnaire, and also from other varieties of the same crop that are available in trade. And sometimes we even go to botanical gardens and nurseries and gather information of any plant material that is of common knowledge of that crop. When we start developing our test guideline, we follow a 3-scenario approach. Next slide, please. Thank you. Firstly, we will see if there are other member states that have experience with this crop. If there is no such a member state, we will go to the second scenario, which is we will look for a similar crop that has a UPOV test guideline. If there is no similar crop with the UPOV test guideline, then we will have to go to approach 3, which is we will draft the test guideline from scratch or from the beginning. Next slide, please. So once we received a new application for a new crop, we start by seeing if there are other member states that have experience with this crop. This information we get from the UPOV website, usually in the Genie database. And sometimes we also look in the Pluto database if we want information for the specific variety that we want to test. Should there be such a member state with experience, we will then go to that member state's website and see if they have any published variety descriptions that we can use for developing our own test guideline. We will also contact that member state and ask them for their willingness to share their test guideline or any variety descriptions that they may have for this crop. From all this information, we will then draft our new national test guideline that we will use during the US examination process of this new application. One must note that during this US examination, this new test guideline is basically tested and approved upon. So this is not a once-off drafting of a test guideline. It is an actual ongoing process. Examples where we used this approach successfully are Plantago, Rafano brassica, and Westringia. Next slide, please. Should there not be a member state with a test guideline or information that we can use, we will go to scenario 2, in which case we will look for similar crops with the UPOV test guideline. This information we also find on the UPOV website, usually under the test guidelines. And we will normally look for a crop with similar morphology. And in most cases, these crops will be taxonomically closely related. Should we find a similar crop with the UPOV test guideline, we will use that UPOV test guideline as the basis to draft our new national test guideline. Once again, this test guideline will be used during the US examination, and this test guideline will be tested and improved upon. Examples where this approach has been used successfully are in, for example, cowpea, in which case we started off with a UPOV asparagus bean test guideline. In Arctotus, we started with a Osteospermum test guideline. And for Felicia, we started with a test guideline of Marguerite daisy. Next slide, please. Should there also not be a UPOV test guideline of a similar crop, we will basically develop the test guideline from scratch or from the beginning. We will then do a detailed research of the crop, mainly on the morphology of the plants and also on the range of variation for the different plant parts, because it is this difference in the variation in plant parts that eventually will lead to characteristics that have different notes. We will use this information to draft our national test guideline, which once again will be used during the US examination and will be tested and improved upon. Examples of test guidelines that we have made from scratch are Decumaria, Hypoxis, and Delosperma, just to name a few. So basically, these are the 3 approaches that we use successfully to develop a new test guideline when there is no UPOV test guideline available. Thank you.
Thank you, Adrian. So please keep your questions. You can start typing your questions on the chat, or also you will be given the chance to interact during the Q&A session. Now, we continue to the next presentation. We would like to invite colleagues from the United Kingdom. Please, Hilary, you have the floor.
Thank you, Leontino. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, loud and clear.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. My name is Hilary Papworth, and I'm technical expert in DOS testing, mainly of ornamental plants, and I'm the current chair of the TWO. I work at NIAB, which is one of the bodies in the United Kingdom which carries out DOS testing. Next slide, please. So just to start, a small amount of background on the UK system. The United Kingdom has national DOS protocols which are based on UPOV guidance, and mainly this is in the form of current UPOV test guidelines. We have a process by which our protocols are adopted and approved within the United Kingdom. This is both for variety listing and for plant breeders' rights. These are overseen by two governance groups in the UK, the National List and Seeds Committee and the Plant Varieties and Seeds Committee. Members of these groups have responsibility for the decisions for listing and for the grant of PBR, and have to agree the protocols under which this work is done. The protocols are reviewed, and any changes that we make to the requirements, standards or characteristics as crop experts have to be agreed by these governance groups. Next slide, please. So not all of the crops in the United Kingdom have UK UPOV test guidelines to base the national protocols on. There are for our biggest crops, but there are many more minor species, particularly ornamentals, where there is no UPOV TG. Our crop experts will develop the testing protocols, and as crop experts, we are active participants in the TWP subgroups, and we act as lead experts in drafting guidance. And we find the working parties an excellent place for discussing these matters and for collaborating with other members, which is, we feel, a very important part of developing guidance. We don't develop guidance or protocols where there are no applications. So the receipt of an application is the trigger for crop experts to develop a protocol. This work is always done according to UPOV guidance, and we rely very heavily on the UPOV documents TGP7, TGP8, and TGP14. Next slide. So in our experience, new guidance might be needed for a completely different genera or species, but we have also had to develop guidance for new methods of propagation where a TG already exists for a genus or species, but not for that particular method of propagation. As Leontino has reminded us, we should look to members of the Union for practical experience, which we would do, but if that doesn't exist, then we would use our experience and the TGP documents to develop our own procedures. Next slide. So the nature of a presentation shows the sequence in a natural order, but that order is actually slightly artificial, because what I'm going to talk to you about now, I tend to think about all as one process. All of these areas overlap with one another, and we need to consider all of them together in order to develop the guidance. So the presentation might seem a little bit like it's an ordered sequence, but it's really a whole process combined together. So a starting point for me would be what what family does the plant genera belong to? That helps us identify existing guidance. So there may be a UPOV protocol that already, UPOV TG that already exists, that we can take a basic list of characteristics for our observations. So that would be a starting point for us for our own UK protocol. Background work, very similar to what Adrian has already described, helps us decide what the scope should be for the national protocol. Are we looking at the species level or maybe the genus level? And we need to think what is in the details of the application. So the information that the applicant is giving us, it may indicate some novel expression that we need to consider in the list of characteristics, or it might hopefully give us information about the method of propagation. So those are very, very important sources of information for us. We also find that checking the taxonomy of the application is a very important step. If something appears to be new, we always make sure that the applicant has used the correct name and that it's not a variant in the terms of the taxonomy, so that we're not developing something new where that name is not actually correct. So using the UPOV resources and the UPOV codes is an important part for us to ensure that the taxonomy is up to date and we have linked together with the correct other applications and TGs. Next slide, please. So I'm using some practical examples of guidance that we have already developed. So testing was undertaken for the species Alonsoa. This is an ornamental plant from the family Sclophia eriaceae. And other plants in this family include Nemesia and Diasia. So at the time of testing Alonsoa, starting the testing, both Nemesia and Diasia had existing UPOV TGs, and the references are there for you to see. Alonsoa is very close in appearance to Diasia, so we use TG233/1 as the basis for our list of characteristics. And the photographs on the side of the slide there show you the similarity in appearance. So in examination of the genus that have been applied for the species, we looked at the list of characteristics, and the resulting protocol that we used contained 24 characteristics compared with 31 in the Diasia TG. Leaf variegation in the Diasia TG was kept as a characteristic for Alonsoa because the new types exhibited variegated foliage, but the Diasia TG contained 4 characteristics relating to flower spurs, and these were removed because it's not an organ present in Alonsoa. So we make sure we are only observing what is relevant to the species in as much as it is possible before we actually see the plants. Our aim is to create an efficient, brief description of the variety, but that is robust enough for the purposes of plant breeders' rights, so that we can describe it well and describe the differences between that and the most similar varieties. Next slide, please. So understanding the range of varieties available is an important step for us. It informs us about the characteristics, but also what the trial design should be. So how much variation is there within a variety? What variation is there between varieties? Or it may be we are so new in the crop that we're looking at, is there anything that truly is considered to be a variety already in common knowledge? So from this information, it helps us inform the trial design. We can think about what data we want to collect, how we're going to observe it, and how many plants we need to make those observations. It also informs us what should be included in the variety collection and what we should use for side-by-side comparison. When we're developing new guidance, we found it important to include in the trial more than just the closest variety. So a broader range of types and characteristic expression is useful when you're developing a protocol. It's never fixed right at the very beginning. We have to be able to refine it as the trial develops. Next slide, please. So the example for scoping of common knowledge in Alonsoa, so at the time of testing, we identified a list of varieties, and this includes the ones that you can see on the screen. In the center of the table, there are 2 varieties with variegated foliage. These are the ones that were the applications for trial. And as far as selecting our varieties for side-by-side comparison, we could have considered that we didn't need to include anything other than the 2 candidates because there were no other varieties with variegated foliage. but we included a greater range to allow for the protocol to be validated and ensure that it is robust. Next slide, please. For ornamental crops, many of the applications that we receive are for vegetatively propagated varieties, but it's not always the case, and it's a very important step for us to establish what the method of propagation is for the variety in trial. It helps establish the trial design, the approach for assessing uniformity. It will help identify what method of observation is appropriate, so either on single plants or groups of plants. And TGP10 provides the following table, which gives guidance on what the method of uniformity is relative to the method of propagation and the type of characteristic. But it's also important when looking at trial design for us to think about the feasibility of the trial, the agronomy of the trial, and minimizing the size of the trial so that we have a clear idea of the cost effectiveness of what we are developing for the protocol. Next slide. So in our example for developing guidance for Alonzoa, the crop was a vegetatively propagated crop, so the resulting trial had a small sample size. There was a minimum of 8 plants required. We had no plot replication. The population standard of 1% with an acceptance probability of at least 95% meant that one off-type was allowed in the sample size of 8. We used visual observation of the characteristics based on groups of plants, and assessment of uniformity was by visual off-types. As far as the agronomy of the trial was concerned, it was grown outside in containers, which matched production method for the crop and its use by end consumers. As far as feasibility and cost effectiveness is concerned, this also matched other trials that we were growing, so it made management of the trials simple and straightforward. Next slide, please. So it may be necessary to further develop trial design. Adrian very well described the process where you have to look at your test guideline as the test is developing to make sure it is correct. And we don't develop guidance where it's not needed. So, for example, we only develop the trial design for the method of propagation that the application reflects. So it may be that a new method of propagation becomes relevant for an already existing species. The steps investigating the species need to be repeated, and that will make sure that the trial design and the methods of observation are appropriate, or that new ones can be proposed that reflect the application that is currently in the test. In the United Kingdom, we're very lucky we are able to consult with a group of expert statisticians. These work with our testing organisations, and you may well have come across them in the capacity of the TWM. Next slide, please. So apologies for anybody who attends the TWO. They may have already seen this slide some time ago in another presentation I did, but I wanted to show a small example where a crop that was predominantly vegetatively propagated had an application for a cross-pollinating seed propagated variety. The protocol was adapted to consider the uniformity standards, the sample size, the method of observations, and this resulted in uniformity going from assessment by only visual off-types to also include relative standards, and this meant that data for some of the QN characteristics was observed rather as MS rather than MG. Next slide. So in conclusion, in the United Kingdom, we use UPOV guidance provided in the TG documents. We investigate the new type. We use comparable species as the basis of the protocol wherever possible. We make the protocol that we develop relevant to the method of propagation for the application. And we try to ensure that the trial design is always feasible and relevant to the species. We validate our protocols with existing varieties of common knowledge, and we have a system where the protocols are peer-reviewed by experts and overseen by our governance bodies. And where needed, we further develop our guidance when new methods of propagation or new expressions become relevant. Thank you very much.